By the late 1980s, Greyhound was in deep trouble. The nation's largest bus operator had stretched itself thin, absorbed trailways, and then found itself buried under debt and labor strife. In 1990, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, a stunning fall for the carrier that once symbolized coast-to-coast travel. Yet even in those dark days, Greyhound couldn't simply stop running. Tens of thousands of passengers still depended on its daily schedules, and the company needed a way to keep moving forward without bleeding money. The answer had to be practical. Greyhound didn't have the luxury of ordering flashy new 45-foot, 102-inch wide coaches like some competitors were beginning to favor. Those larger buses, encouraged by new federal standards in the early 1990s, required updated garages, wider lanes at terminals, and more money than Greyhound could spare. What the company needed was something familiar. 40 feet long, 96 inches wide, just like the thousands of MC-9s it had been running since the 1970s. That's where Motor Coach Industries stepped in. Rather than pushing Greyhound into a modern design it couldn't afford, MCI offered a stripped-down, no-nonsense model that balanced cost with reliability. It wasn't meant to turn heads or win design awards. It was meant to keep schedules running, to be easy to service, and to last long enough for Greyhound to get back on its feet. The name was MC-12, and though it looked like a close cousin of the old MC-9, its mission was squarely aimed at survival. The MC-12 wasn't a clean-sheet design. In many ways, it was a bridge, halfway between the familiar MC-9 that had carried America through the 1970s and 80s, and the more modern 96 A3 that represented MCY's letter series line. At first glance, the MC-12 looked almost identical to the late production MC-9 Special. The same squared-off profile, the same slanted rear cap, even the same proportions. For passengers waiting at a Greyhound depot, it was nearly impossible to tell one from the other. Beneath the skin, however, the MC-12 borrowed elements from MCY's newer generation. Its frame and mechanical layout owed much to the A-series, giving it a slightly updated backbone compared to the MC-9. But there was no mistaking its purpose. This was not a coach designed to capture new markets or dazzle charter operators. It was designed almost exclusively for Greyhound. That singular focus meant the MC-12 never enjoyed broad sales. Unlike the versatile MC-9, which served everyone from trailways to church groups, the MC-12 lived mostly in Greyhound's fleet. Still, in the early 1990s, its presence was anything but minor. At one point, Greyhound fielded as many as 801 of them, a staggering number that underscored just how crucial the model was to the company's survival. In short, the MC-12 filled a very specific role. Not a breakthrough in design, but a practical stopgap machine that bridged past and present at a time when Greyhound could afford little else. Structurally, the MC-12 carried on MCI's tradition of building integral coaches, bodies and frames designed as one solid unit. This gave it the kind of strength and rigidity that operators expected from a true highway coach, while also making it easier to maintain over years of hard service. In an era when cost-cutting could mean compromises, the MC-12 still offered a dependable backbone that Greyhound mechanics knew how to work with. Dimensionally, it stayed with the proven formula: 40 feet long and 96 inches wide. By the early 1990s, that made it something of a throwback, as most new designs were stretching to 45 feet and the full 102 inches of width now permitted by federal law. Yet for Greyhound, the smaller size fit the depots, maintenance bays, and route clearances already in place. The MC-12 may not have been forward-looking, but it was practical. Visually, one feature stood out: the slanted rear cap. This angled tail had been a signature of MCI coaches since the 1960s, but the MC-12 would be the last model to carry it. For many riders, that tilted back end became a familiar sight disappearing down the highway. Beneath it, Wide underfloor luggage bays swallowed passenger bags with ease, while large side windows and a single passenger entry door kept the layout simple. It was a coach built more for function than flair, but in that simplicity lay its strength. Under the skin, the MC-12 carried the same kind of workhorse engines that had powered American coaches for decades. Early production units relied on the Detroit Diesel 6V92TA, a two-stroke V6 that delivered between 300 and 335 horsepower. Greyhound's mechanics knew this engine inside and out. It was the same basic power plant that had served faithfully in countless MC9s. The 6V92TA wasn't glamorous, but it was tough, easy to service, and kept parts inventories simple across the fleet. As the 1990s moved forward, MCI began installing Detroit's newer Series 50 in later MC-12s. This four-stroke inline-four produced about 315 horsepower, not dramatically stronger on paper, but cleaner and more efficient. The switch also reflected a wider industry shift away from the smoky two-strokes that had defined intercity coaches since the 1960s. Transmission choices were equally pragmatic. Coaches with the 6V92TA typically paired with Allison's HT740 or HT748 automatic gearboxes, rugged units designed to handle the constant pounding of cross-country service. Later Series 50 models came with the electronic Allison B500, offering smoother shifts and better fuel economy. Fuel capacity was generous, with tanks holding roughly 213 gallons, enough for long runs between terminals. Greyhound even governed many MC-12 to a top speed of 68 miles per hour. It wasn't about slowing passengers down, it was about squeezing every possible mile from a gallon of diesel. In the age of tight budgets, efficiency mattered just as much as horsepower. Step inside an MC-12 and you wouldn't mistake it for a luxury liner. Seating was straightforward. 47 Amaya Brazil seats arranged in rows, built more for durability than plush comfort. The upholstery could withstand years of heavy use, and the frames were easy to service if something broke. At the very back sat a compact lavatory, standard for long-haul routes, giving passengers basic convenience without stealing too much space. The interior reflected the same philosophy as the rest of the coach: function over flash. Panels were plain, lighting was simple, and surfaces were chosen for how easily they could be cleaned at the end of a long day's run. Greyhound needed buses that could turn quickly between routes, and every design choice leaned towards saving time in the garage. One feature passengers did appreciate was the climate control. The MC-12 carried a carrier air conditioning system, a must-have for trips across the American South and Southwest. Keeping a full load of riders comfortable in summer heat wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. Compared to a Prevost Le Mirage or an Eagle Model 15, the MC-12 never aimed to impress. It was a workhorse built to move crowds reliably and economically. For the average traveler, that meant a ride that was steady, predictable, and available when they needed it most. For Greyhound, the appeal of the MC-12 wasn't about image, it was about numbers. This coach promised lower ownership costs at a time when the company couldn't afford surprises. With its proven driveline and no-frills construction, the MC-12 offered the kind of reliability that translated directly into fewer breakdowns and less downtime. One of its greatest strengths lay in parts commonality. Because the MC-12 shared so much with the older MC-9, Greyhound's maintenance teams didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Spare parts were already on the shelves, mechanics were already trained, and the learning curve was minimal. That familiarity kept service costs under control and made it easier to keep hundreds of buses on the road every day. Drivers often described the MC-12 as steady and predictable. It tracked well on the highway, the steering felt familiar, and the automatic transmissions handled long hauls without complaint. No one claimed it was as powerful or refined as the newer 102 D3 or DL3 coaches that would follow, but in the early 1990s, stability mattered more than cutting-edge performance. In short, the MC-12 was exactly what Greyhound needed in a lean era, a dependable workhorse that kept schedules running and routes alive. It wasn't a coach that set new standards, but it filled its role faithfully, giving the company breathing room until better days returned. Not every MC-12 carried paying passengers. In 1994, MCI built a small batch of coaches that took the basic Greyhound spec design and reimagined it for a very different purpose: prisoner transport. Known officially as Inmate Security Transport Vehicles, or ISTVS, these buses looked ordinary from the outside but were heavily modified within. The ISTV versions kept the same Detroit Diesel Series 50 engine and Allison B500 transmission found in late production MC-12s, but their interiors were completely reworked. Instead of rows of fabric-covered Amaya seats, the space was outfitted with reinforced barriers, secure compartments, and locking systems designed to move inmates safely over long distances. Windows were protected, lavatories were adapted for security, and access points were configured to limit movement once passengers were on board. Beyond these prison transport models, the MC-12 saw limited use outside Greyhound. A few small operators and government agencies picked up units, either directly from MCY or later on the used market. But the numbers were never large. Unlike the versatile MC-9, which became a common sight across charter fleets, the MC-12 remained tied to its primary customer. Still, the ISTV variant stands as one of the more unusual chapters in MCY's history, proof that even a workhorse design could be adapted when necessity demanded. In the grand sweep of MCI history, the MC-12 was never a high-volume blockbuster. Production numbers stayed modest, with the overwhelming majority delivered straight into Greyhound's fleet. That narrow customer base meant the model never achieved the widespread presence of the MC-9, but within Greyhound's network, it carried enormous weight. For much of the early 1990s, hundreds of MC-12s kept schedules alive at a time when the company's very survival was in doubt. In that sense, the MC-12 was a bridge. It wasn't a bold leap forward, but a practical link between the aging MC-9s and the wave of modern coaches that would soon arrive. By the mid-1990s, new standards were shaping the industry. The Americans with Disabilities Act required accessible coaches with wheelchair lifts, and operators increasingly demanded the roomier, 102-inch wide, 45-foot-long designs that could seat more passengers and deliver greater comfort. MCI answered with the 102D3 and its longer sibling, the 102DL3, both powered by Detroit's four-stroke Series 60. Compared to these sleek successors, the MC-12 already felt like a coach from another era. As the new models rolled in, the MC-12s gradually faded from Greyhound's frontline service. A few lingered in secondary roles or on the resale market, but most were worked hard until retirement. Today, they live on less in photographs than in memory. The plain, square-sided buses that quietly carried millions of Americans in the 1990s. For countless riders, the sight of an MC-12 at the depot wasn't remarkable at the time, but it has since become a silent chapter in Greyhound's long story. If you ever stepped aboard an MC-12, if you remember the feel of those Amaya seats, the hum of a Detroit diesel two-stroke, or the cool rush of carrier air on a hot summer ride, we'd love to hear your story. Share your memories in the comments below, because every bus, no matter how humble, carries a piece of our shared history. And if you've enjoyed this look back at a forgotten workhorse of the highway, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Together, we'll keep these stories alive, one coach at a time.